In this section, we're going to finish up cellular respiration, talking about the electron transport chain, and then we're also going to talk about fermentation, which is kind of the cell's way around some of the oxygen needs, or at least a temporary way around. So, this is the electron transport chain. It's often referred to as the ETC. Okay, so we're going to go into this step by step. It is relatively similar to what we saw in the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. So the electron transport chain will use NADH and FADH2 in order to make ATP. Okay, so the NADHs and the FADH2 come from the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So these, again, are your high-energy compounds, or basically they are transport mechanisms, vessels, for these high-energy electrons that are going to enter the electron transport chain. So this energy is again going to be used to transport hydrogen ions across the inner membrane. And that's going to be against the hydrogen ions concentration gradient. So it does use that energy in order to do this transportation. And then the hydrogen ions are eventually going to find their way to an ATP synthase, flow through it, which is going to be in the membrane, and that's going to produce the ATP. Alright, so step one. First up, you have to remove the electrons from the NADH and the FADH2s. Okay, so these electrons are going to kind of hop off and then enter into the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, that's going to release NAD plus and FAD2 plus. Okay, so remember that one's a little bit weird. It's also going to release the hydrogen ions. Okay, so these hydrogen ions are what are actually going to be transported across the inner membrane. Okay, so the NADH and the FADH2s don't just bring in the high energy electrons, they also bring in the hydrogens. Okay, so it's nice and useful there. So those hydrogens are going to be transported from the transported across the inner membrane out of the matrix. So they're going to go into the inner membrane space. All right. So the NADHs, FADH2s, those are coming up to this membrane from the matrix side. Okay, so from the innermost side of it. And then once you build up that concentration of the hydrogen ions on the outside of this inner membrane, okay, then they are going to flow across the membrane again, but this time they're going to go through the ATP synthase. Okay, so you use all this energy to build up this concentration of the H plus ions, and then that concentration is basically allowed to relax by flowing through the ATP synthase. Okay, and that's going to transform ADP into ATP, right? And then finally, water is actually formed because you're going to have oxygen come in, and it's going to pick up both electrons and the hydrogens. Okay, so each oxygen is going to pick up 2 electrons and 2 hydrogens, releasing water itself. Okay, so the breakdown of one glucose molecule actually produces up to 38 molecules of ATP. So it is a really good process for getting as much energy out of the ATP as possible. And then ATP synthase again shows up and it produces the ATP. So in this case, the ATP synthase is found in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. In photosynthesis, it was found in the thylakoid membranes, okay, which was also the inner membrane of the chloroplast. So you do also get your 2 ATP from glycolysis. Okay, you get 2 ATP out of the Krebs cycle, and up to 34 ATP from the electron transport chain. So you can get a max of that 38 molecules of ATP from the entire process of cellular respiration. Okay, 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, 34 from the electron transport chain. And then oxygen picks up the electrons and the hydrogen ions after they've been used and kind of, ditches them outside the cell as water. And water is released as a waste product. Okay, so this is looking at a breakdown of the two processes we've been talking about, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you have your organelles. Okay, photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. Cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria. You've got your reactants, okay, which for photosynthesis are CO2 and H2O. For cellular respiration, it's sugar or glucose and O2, oxygen. And then you also have an electron transport chain in both processes. So in photosynthesis, the proteins or the ATP synthase is within the thylakoid membrane. In cellular respiration, it is found within the inner mitochondrial membrane, which, basically the same in both. They're just called slightly different. And then you also have the cycle of chemical reactions. So the Calvin cycle for photosynthesis takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast and builds sugar molecules. For the Krebs cycle, it's going to take place in the matrix of the mitochondria, and it's going to break down carbon-based molecules. Okay, instead of building them up, now we're breaking them down. Okay, and your products are going to be, for photosynthesis, sugars and oxygen, and for cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water. All right, so we also have fermentation. So where we were talking about glycolysis and Krebs cycle both being anaerobic processes, and then also the electron transport chain being aerobic, so it needs oxygen. Also talked about the Krebs cycle being kind of one of those weird parts where it does get backed up if oxygen is not present, simply because its products cannot go into the electron transport chain. Okay, and then as a result of that backup, the process of glycolysis would actually stall as well. But fortunately, the cells kind of have a way to get around that, at least for a short amount of time. And that is through the process of fermentation. So there are two different types of fermentation we're going to talk about. Humans only do one of the types. Okay, otherwise exercise would be a whole lot more interesting. But anaerobic process of fermentation basically is to kind of get away with not having enough oxygen to go through the whole process of cellular respiration. Okay, so it's still producing small amounts of ATP. It's still allowing the cell to go through glycolysis without going through the rest of the Krebs cycle and the ETC. Okay, so and it does this by only using glycolysis and then kind of regenerating the necessary compounds in order to keep glycolysis moving. So in humans, it's called lactic acid fermentation. So in lactic acid fermentation, glycolysis will produce 2 pyruvates, 2 ATP, and 2 NADHs. Lactic acid fermentation will actually turn the pyruvate into lactic acid by using the 2 NADHs. Okay, so at this point, you've taken the pyruvate, created lactic acid from it, you've produced 2 ATP, which the cell can use, and then you've also produced the 2 NADHs. So normally those NADHs will get used in the electron transport chain. But at this point, they really can't go there because you don't have enough oxygen to actually run the electron transport chain. And so you will eventually get backed up in glycolysis because you don't have any more NAD pluses in order to kind of mug the glucose for energy. Okay, so you have to be able to regenerate the NAD pluses in some way. So by rearranging the carbons in the pyruvate to form lactic acid, you can actually use up those NADHs to produce NAD pluses again. And that allows you to continue going through glycolysis. Okay, so regenerates the NAD plus to be used in glycolysis again and allows glycolysis to continue. So this is the process here. So you've got glycolysis, breaks down a glucose molecule, produces 2 ATP, 2 net ATP, and 2 NADH, and also 2 pyruvate. Well, the pyruvate can't enter the Krebs cycle because the Krebs cycle is backed up with no oxygen available. And then you also need to regenerate the NAD pluses. So then the cell will enter lactic acid fermentation, produce 2 lactic acid from the 2 pyruvate by using up the 2 NADHs and returning the NAD pluses back to the beginning of the whole process here. So, if you go and start running and you start feeling that burn in your muscles, that is actually lactic acid fermentation taking place. Because when you're exercising, especially strenuously, you're using up more oxygen than your cells are able to really get, okay? So you're starting to kind of starve your cells of oxygen, right? Which is why you get cramps and all of that, why you have to stop. And part of exercise is actually conditioning your body to be able to kind of draw in more oxygen with each breath and also use it more efficiently, okay? So, whenever you start exercising and you get really, that burn going, you can think of biology, because it's lactic acid fermentation. And that's why the burn takes a little while to actually go away, because once you start getting oxygen back into your system, it will go through that lactic acid and convert it back into pyruvate. Just completely reverse this lactic acid fermentation. But that does take a while. So you do still have that lactic acid creating that burn that takes a while to go away. Okay, so you also have something called alcoholic fermentation. So this is similar to lactic acid fermentation. It's just a slightly different compound that's going to be produced. So again, you have glycolysis taking place that's yielding 2 pyruvates, 2 ATP, and 2 NADHs. Alcoholic fermentation uses a different process to regenerate the NAD pluses that are needed. Okay, so the energy from those 2 NADHs is then used to split pyruvate into a 2-carbon alcohol and carbon dioxide. Okay, so that releases an NADH plus back into the cytoplasm, which can then be used for glycolysis again. And so it also releases an alcohol. So again, you're going through glycolysis like normal, and this time instead of creating lactic acid, you're going to produce the 2 carbon alcohols and 2 carbon dioxides while regenerating the 2 NAD pluses. So fermentation is actually used to produce different foods. This is actually how we produce alcohols from different fruits and wheat and barley and grains and hops and things like that. Okay, but you can also use fermentation to produce yogurt, cheese, and bread. Okay, so especially with bread, the rising effect that you get with when you're making bread is due to the carbon dioxide release. Okay, and because of the baking process, it doesn't have any of the alcohol left if it's even going to undergo that. So the alcoholic fermentation is only done by very specific organisms like yeast. Okay, which is why I said, humans obviously don't undergo lactic acid or undergo alcoholic fermentation or otherwise, because anytime you worked out, you would be producing alcohol inside your body and getting drunk. So it would be a very different world if we went through alcoholic fermentation instead of lactic acid fermentation. But that is the end of this chapter.